The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Hangar 7, casting harsh shadows across the polished concrete floor of Ramstein Air Base. Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez moved methodically through the maintenance bay, her clipboard gripped firmly as she checked inventory against the morning's requisition forms. Her sleeves were rolled up in the warmth of the hangar, revealing a network of jagged scars that ran along both forearms like lightning frozen against her skin. The maintenance bay buzzed with its usual morning activity. Technicians called to each other over the distant whine of aircraft engines being tested outside. The smell of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel permeated everything, a scent that Rodriguez had long ago stopped noticing. "Lieutenant, we've got those hydraulic components logged and stored," called Master Sergeant Williams, a weathered NCO who'd been at Ramstein longer than most of the officers. Rodriguez nodded. "Thank you, Sergeant. Any issues with the shipment?" "None, ma'am. Everything accounted for." Williams' voice carried the easy confidence of someone who'd been doing this job for decades. Their exchange was efficient, professional, utterly forgettable to most observers. But Williams held her gaze a beat longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement passing between them before he returned to his duties. From across the hangar, Private First Class Tyler Jenkins watched the exchange with amusement. Fresh out of tech school with top marks, he'd arrived at Ramstein 3 weeks ago with a group of equally green airmen who hung on his every word. His service uniform was still crisp, unworn by the rigors of real deployment. His confidence, however, far exceeded his experience. "Check out Lieutenant Papercuts," Jenkins snickered to his audience, gesturing subtly toward Rodriguez. "What kind of maintenance officer looks like they lost a fight with barbed wire?" His friends laughed on cue, their voices carrying just far enough to be heard, but not quite far enough to be called insubordination. They were getting comfortable in their new posting, learning how far they could push boundaries without crossing them completely. Rodriguez approached their section, her gait steady and purposeful. She didn't look at Jenkins or his friends directly, but something in her posture suggested she'd heard every word. "Stand at attention when an officer passes," barked Staff Sergeant Davis from nearby, his voice cutting through the chatter. The group straightened half-heartedly, more performance than respect. As Rodriguez passed, Jenkins couldn't help himself. Something about her calm demeanor, her apparent refusal to acknowledge his barbs, made him push further. "Careful with those maintenance reports, Lieutenant," he called out just loud enough to be heard. "Looks like you already lost one fight with some paperwork." The hangar didn't fall silent. It never completely did, but a noticeable hush spread. Among the nearby senior enlisted, conversations paused. Tools stopped moving. Eyes darted between Jenkins and Rodriguez. Rodriguez paused, turning slowly to face Jenkins. Her expression wasn't angry or offended, just quietly assessing. Their eyes met for a long moment, hers steady, his increasingly uncomfortable, though he couldn't articulate why. There was something in that gaze, something that made his skin prickle with an unfamiliar sensation. She said nothing, simply continued her rounds. "Man, what's her problem?" Jenkins muttered, trying to shake the strange feeling her gaze had left him with. An older crew chief nearby spoke without looking up from his work. "You might want to ease up, kid." "What for?" "She's just a maintenance officer. Probably got those scars falling into a file cabinet." The crew chief shook his head, but said nothing more. His silence spoke volumes, but Jenkins was too cocky to hear what wasn't being said. Throughout the morning, Rodriguez continued her duties with quiet efficiency. She helped a young airman troubleshoot a diagnostic system, her instructions clear and patient. She updated inventory logs, coordinated with supply, and signed off on completed maintenance tasks. She moved through the hangar like a ghost present, but somehow separate from the casual camaraderie that flowed around her. Jenkins watched her periodically, his curiosity growing despite himself. He noticed how the senior NCOs treated her differently than other officers. There was none of the grudging respect or behind-the-back eye-rolling that usually accompanied interactions with lieutenants fresh from officer training. Instead, they spoke to her with a deference that seemed out of proportion to her rank. They listened when she spoke. Something about Lieutenant Rodriguez didn't add up. But Jenkins was too arrogant to consider that maybe, just maybe, he was the one missing something important. Later that morning, all personnel were called to the daily briefing in the command center. Jenkins found himself seated near the back, surrounded by his usual group of friends. They exchanged quiet jokes as the room filled, their attention more on each other than on the officers assembling at the front. Colonel Harrington, the base commander, took his position at the podium. "Good morning, people. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get started." The briefing proceeded with the usual updates on operations, maintenance schedules, and security protocols. Jenkins found his attention wandering until Colonel Harrington began discussing a classified component failure on one of the new stealth drones. The thermal signature is unavoidable with the current configuration, Harrington explained confidently, pointing to a technical diagram displayed on the screen behind him. "We'll need to adjust mission parameters to account for this limitation." From the back of the room, Rodriguez cleared her throat softly. "Sir, if I may." All heads turned. Lieutenant Rodriguez rarely spoke during these briefings. "Go ahead." "Lieutenant," Harrington said, a hint of impatience in his tone. "The signature issue could be mitigated by reversing the intake manifold orientation," Rodriguez suggested, her voice calm and assured. "It worked on the earlier prototype. The blueprints in archives confirm it would be compatible with the current model." Harrington paused, then nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, Lieutenant. I'd forgotten about that solution. Make it happen." Jenkins watched the exchange with growing confusion. Since when did full-bird colonels defer to lieutenants on technical matters? And how did a maintenance officer have such detailed knowledge of classified drone systems? As the briefing ended and personnel began filing out, Jenkins found himself watching Rodriguez more closely. She gathered her materials efficiently, exchanged a few words with a captain from intelligence, and headed for the door. Jenkins nudged his friend. "Be right back," he muttered, then quickened his pace to intercept Rodriguez in the hallway outside. "Hey, Lieutenant," he called, catching up to her. She turned, her expression neutral. Up close, he could see that her scars were deeper than he'd initially thought, the kind that came from serious trauma rather than accidental injury. "Private," she acknowledged with a small nod. "I could show you how maintenance should be done sometime," Jenkins offered with a condescending smile. "Might help avoid future accidents." He reached toward her arm as if to gesture at her scars. Rodriguez shifted away from his hand with a fluid movement that seemed oddly practiced, not defensive, but precise, almost instinctive, like someone who had spent years training to avoid unseen threats. "I appreciate the offer, Private," she said, her voice level, "but I think I can manage." A veteran pilot passing by caught the interaction and gave Rodriguez a respectful nod that seemed strangely deferential. "Lieutenant," the pilot acknowledged with a tone one might use addressing a superior officer rather than someone two ranks below him. Jenkins frowned. Something didn't add up. The respect she commanded from senior personnel, her detailed knowledge of classified systems, the way she moved, those scars, they told a story that contradicted everything her rank and position suggested. "Just trying to help, ma'am," Jenkins said, recovering his smirk. "Seems like you could use some guidance on staying safe around equipment." Something flickered in Rodriguez's eyes, not anger, something deeper. For a moment, Jenkins felt like he was being assessed by a predator, measured and found wanting. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual composed expression. Safety is important, she agreed mildly. So is knowing the difference between a battle you need to fight and one you should walk away from. She held his gaze for one more moment before continuing down the hallway. Jenkins watched her go, his certainty shaken. The command hadn't been a threat, it had been advice. And somehow, that made it more unsettling than any direct confrontation would have been. "You're playing with fire, Jenkins," came Staff Sergeant Davis's voice from behind him. Jenkins turned to find the sergeant watching him with an unreadable expression. "Sir, she's just a maintenance officer." Davis shook his head. "There are things you don't understand about this base yet, Private. People who aren't what they seem. What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you should focus on your job and stop trying to impress your friends by mocking your superiors." Davis's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Jenkins returned to his duties, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Throughout the rest of the day, he found himself watching Rodriguez from a distance, noting how she interacted with others, how she carried herself. There was an economy of movement, a quiet vigilance that seemed out of place in a maintenance officer. When their shift ended, Jenkins lingered in the hangar, watching as Rodriguez completed her final checks for the day. She spoke briefly with Master Sergeant Williams, their conversation too quiet to overhear. Williams nodded several times, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like deference. As Rodriguez finally headed for the exit, she paused, gazing out across the darkened airfield where lights glowed along the runway. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and Jenkins caught a glimpse of something in her expression: longing. Regret? He couldn't place it, but it made her suddenly seem more human than she had all day. Then she was gone, disappearing into the growing darkness outside, leaving Jenkins with questions he couldn't articulate and a nagging sense that he had badly misjudged something he didn't understand. The next morning brought troubling news. Jenkins arrived at the hangar to find his friends huddled around a computer terminal, their faces grim. "What's going on?" he asked, joining the group. "Check this out," said Airman Bradley, pointing at the screen. "Remember that classified drone Rodriguez was talking about yesterday? There was an incident with it overnight." Jenkins leaned in to read the report. A prototype drone had experienced a critical failure during a test flight, crash landing in a restricted area. The preliminary investigation suggested the thermal signature issue Rodriguez had mentioned might have been a factor. "If she knew about this problem," Jenkins said slowly, "why didn't she speak up sooner?" "Maybe she tried," suggested another airman. "Maybe nobody listened to the maintenance officer until it was too late." The thought gnawed at Jenkins throughout the morning. He found himself paying closer attention to the interactions between Rodriguez and the other officers, noticing subtle signs he'd missed before. The way senior officers sometimes paused when she spoke, as if considering her words more carefully than they would those of a typical lieutenant. The way certain conversations stopped when she approached, not from disrespect but from something that looked more like security consciousness. During lunch, Jenkins overheard two master sergeants talking in low voices near the vending machines. Should have listened to her about the thermal issue, one was saying. "She's been right about these things before. How many times does she have to prove herself?" The other replied. "Just because she's keeping a low profile doesn't mean we should ignore her expertise." Jenkins felt a chill run down his spine. What expertise? What low profile? He was beginning to realize that his assumptions about Rodriguez might be dangerously wrong. That afternoon, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of joining his friends for their usual afternoon break, he sought out Master Sergeant Williams in the parts inventory room. "Sergeant, can I ask you something?" Williams looked up from his clipboard, his expression cautious. "What's on your mind, Jenkins?" "It's about Lieutenant Rodriguez. There's something about her that doesn't add up." Williams set down his clipboard and fixed Jenkins with a stern look. What kind of something? The way people treat her, the things she knows, those scars. Jenkins paused, then plunged ahead. She's not just a maintenance officer, is she? For a long moment, Williams said nothing. Then he sighed deeply. Jenkins, there are some things in this military that are above your pay grade and your clearance level. My advice? Drop it. Do your job. Show some respect. But, no buts, Williams interrupted. Some questions are better left unasked. Some stories are better left untold. And some people deserve better than to have their business gossiped about by green recruits who don't know what they're talking about. The rebuke stung, but it also confirmed Jenkins's growing suspicion that there was much more to Rodriguez than met the eye. As he left the inventory room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something much larger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The breaking point came 3 days later during the morning briefing. Colonel Harrington was discussing security protocols when he made an announcement that sent ripples through the assembled personnel. We've received word that we'll be hosting an unscheduled inspection next week, Harrington said, his tone carefully neutral. General Maxwell Thornton from European Command will be conducting a comprehensive review of our operations. Jenkins noticed Rodriguez stiffen almost imperceptibly in her seat. It was the first real reaction he'd seen from her, and it made his pulse quicken. Around the room, senior officers exchanged meaningful glances. After the briefing, Jenkins lingered, hoping to catch another glimpse of Rodriguez's reaction. Instead, he overheard a conversation between two captains that made his blood run cold. Think she knows? One was asking in a low voice. Thornton? He'd have to be briefed on current personnel, the other replied. The question is whether she wants to be recognized. After what happened in Kandahar, I'd understand if she wanted to stay under the radar. Some things you can't hide from forever. Jenkins felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Kandahar, that was Afghanistan. Combat theater. What had Rodriguez done in Afghanistan that required hiding from a general? The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that terrified him. The scars weren't from accidents, they were from combat. The respect from senior personnel wasn't just professional courtesy, it was earned through actions he couldn't begin to imagine. And the quiet competence wasn't just good training. It was the kind of skill that came from life and death situations. But instead of backing down, instead of recognizing the enormity of his mistake, Jenkins felt his pride kick in. He'd been made to look foolish, and his ego couldn't handle it. If Rodriguez had some kind of secret background, if she was hiding something important, then maybe she deserved to be taken down a peg. That afternoon, he made the worst decision of his military career. I've been thinking, he announced to his friends during their break. There's something weird about Lieutenant Rodriguez. All that respect from the senior NCOs. The way she knows things about classified systems, I think she might be hiding something. What kind of something? Asked Airman Bradley, leaning in. With interest. I don't know yet, Jenkins said, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. But I'm going to find out. And when I do, maybe people will realize she's not as special as they think she is. It was a declaration of war, though Jenkins didn't realize it at the time. He was about to take on an opponent who had fought and won battles he couldn't even imagine, and he was bringing nothing but arrogance and wounded pride to the fight. The next morning, Jenkins began his campaign of subtle harassment. He questioned Rodriguez's decisions more openly, made sarcastic comments about her mysterious expertise, and generally tried to undermine her authority in front of other personnel. Rodriguez responded to his provocations with the same quiet professionalism she'd always shown, which only frustrated Jenkins more. He wanted a reaction, wanted to crack that composed exterior and prove that she was just another officer with a secret to hide. He got his wish in the worst possible way. On Friday afternoon, as Jenkins was loudly questioning one of Rodriguez's technical recommendations to a group of junior enlisted, she finally spoke up. "Private Jenkins," she said, her voice cutting through his commentary like a blade. "A word." The hangar fell silent. Every eye turned to watch as Rodriguez walked toward the equipment room, clearly expecting Jenkins to follow. He did, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Inside the equipment room, Rodriguez turned to face him. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked truly angry. "I've been patient with you, Private," she said, her voice low and controlled. "But your behavior is affecting unit cohesion and operational efficiency. It stops now. I'm just asking questions," Jenkins replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Trying to understand why a maintenance officer knows so much about classified systems." Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment. "You want to know what I know, Private? You want to understand where these scars came from?" She rolled up her sleeves, revealing the full extent of the damage to her arms. "I know what it feels like to carry a wounded soldier 3 miles through enemy territory while bleeding from shrapnel wounds. I know what it sounds like when a convoy hits an IED, and you're the only one left standing. I know what it means to make life and death decisions when there's no time to think and no room for error." Jenkins felt the blood drain from his face. The quiet intensity in her voice, the pain in her eyes, this wasn't the reaction of someone with something to hide. This was the response of someone who had seen hell and lived to tell about it. "But more than that," Rodriguez continued, "I know what it means to serve quietly, without recognition, without glory, because the mission matters more than personal pride. Something you might want to learn before you find yourself in a situation where it matters." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The general arrives Monday, Private. I suggest you spend the weekend thinking about what kind of soldier you want to be." With that, she was gone, leaving Jenkins alone with the crushing realization that he had just declared war on someone who had already fought and won battles that would haunt his nightmares. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp German air that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Jenkins had spent the weekend in a state of nervous anticipation, Rodriguez's words echoing in his mind. He'd tried to dismiss them as psychological warfare, but the quiet conviction in her voice had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The base was in full preparation mode for General Thornton's inspection. Every surface had been cleaned, every regulation double-checked, every piece of equipment polished to a mirror shine. Jenkins and his crew had been pulled from regular duty to help prepare the command center's briefing materials. "This is garbage duty," Jenkins complained, arranging a stack of folders at each seat around the conference table. "I didn't go through advanced technical training to play janitor for a bunch of brass." "Just shut up and work, Jenkins," one of his peers muttered. "The sooner we finish, the sooner we get out of here." Jenkins continued grumbling as he worked, his complaints growing louder when Rodriguez entered the command center. She moved to her station near the maintenance coordination terminal, checking systems with her usual methodical efficiency. "Look who it is," Jenkins said, loud enough to be heard by his friends, but not quite loud enough to be considered insubordination. Lieutenant Scarface, back for another thrilling day of pushing papers. A few of his friends snickered, though the laughter was more subdued than usual. His audience was dwindling, their amusement at his jokes fading as they settled into the rhythms of base life. Jenkins felt the need to push further, to recapture their attention. "Hey, Lieutenant," he called across the room. "Did you hear about the inspection today? Better make sure your paperwork is in order. Wouldn't want any more accidents." Rodriguez didn't acknowledge him at all, continuing her work as if he hadn't spoken. Her indifference only fueled his irritation. He opened his mouth for another barb when the doors to the command center swung open forcefully. "Attention on deck," someone shouted. In walked General Maxwell Thornton, 4-star commander of European Command, flanked by an entourage of high-ranking officers. His chest was adorned with rows of ribbons and medals, each telling a story of decades of distinguished service. Everyone in the room snapped to attention, including Jenkins, though he was a beat slow. Colonel Harrington stepped forward. "Welcome to Ramstein, General. We're honored by your visit." "At ease," the general replied, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone who had spent a lifetime giving orders that others followed without question. "This isn't a formal inspection, Colonel. I was in the area for the NATO conference and thought I'd drop by to see how our finest European base is functioning." The room relaxed marginally, though everyone remained alert and professional. The general began his standard inspection walkthrough, nodding at senior officers as he passed, occasionally stopping to ask questions about operations or specific projects. It was all very routine, very expected. Rodriguez stood quietly at her station near the maintenance coordination terminal, at attention like everyone else. Her expression was neutral, professional, revealing nothing of her thoughts as the general made his way around the room. Then it happened. General Thornton stopped abruptly mid-stride. His eyes widened as they fell on Rodriguez, recognition dawning on his face like the sun breaking through clouds. "My God," he said, his authoritative voice suddenly hushed. "Phantom, is that really you?" The room, already quiet, fell into an eerie silence broken only by the soft hum of computer equipment. Senior officers exchanged shocked glances, eyebrows raised in surprise or confusion. "The Phantom?" a colonel whispered to his aide. "From Operation Blackstone?" Jenkins watched in confusion as every experienced soldier in the room somehow stood even straighter. Their attention split between the general and the quiet maintenance officer he'd been mocking for weeks. There was something happening here that he didn't understand, a current of recognition and respect flowing through the room that excluded him and the other new arrivals. "It's good to see you, sir," Rodriguez replied quietly, her voice steady but her eyes revealing a flicker of something unreadable. Then it happened, something Jenkins would later describe as the most shocking thing he'd ever witnessed in his military career. General Thornton, a man who commanded thousands of troops across Europe, rendered a crisp salute to Lieutenant Rodriguez before she could salute him. The breach of military protocol was so profound that Jenkins felt his jaw physically drop. You didn't salute downward, ever, unless someone had earned a Medal of Honor, but even then, the protocol was different. "Colonel Rodriguez," General Thornton said warmly. "It's been too long, Colonel." Jenkins felt the blood drain from his face as fragments of hushed stories from basic training rushed back to him. The Phantom, operations in North Africa, the rescue mission that saved a diplomatic delegation from certain death. The operator whose tactical genius had become legend, known only by a call sign for operational security. "Sir, Rodriguez apparently," Colonel Rodriguez responded quietly. She glanced briefly around the room, noticing the stares, the confusion, the dawning recognition on some faces. Of course, the general nodded. "But surely they could have given you a more appropriate assignment than maintenance." "I requested this assignment, sir. I prefer it." Her voice was firm, suggesting the topic was not open for discussion, even with a 4-star general. The general smiled knowingly, still avoiding the spotlight. Some things never change. He turned to address the room. "For those of you who don't know, you've been working alongside one of the finest tactical minds in our military. Colonel Rodriguez led operations that most of you have only heard whispers about, the kind that change history without making it into the history books. Jenkins felt physically ill. Every joke, every smirk, every condescending comment he'd made came rushing back to him in horrifying clarity. He had been mocking not just any officer, but a living legend, someone who had apparently done things so classified that most people didn't even know her real name. The general continued. Colonel Rodriguez was the architect behind Operation Blackstone, which some of you senior officers might be familiar with. For the rest of you, let's just say that when our country needed someone to do the impossible, they sent the Phantom. Throughout this revelation, Rodriguez maintained her composure, standing straight but looking increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. It was the most emotion Jenkins had seen her display since his arrival at the base. "Sir, perhaps we could continue this conversation privately," she suggested, her voice respectful but firm. "Always the professional," the general chuckled. "Very well. Colonel Harrington, might we use your office?" "Of course, General," Harrington replied, gesturing toward his private office at the back of the command center. His voice had changed. Jenkins noticed. There was new deference there, not just for the general, but for Rodriguez as well. As Rodriguez walked past him toward the office, Jenkins couldn't meet her eyes. Shame burned through him like acid, eating away at the cocky exterior he had cultivated since arriving at Ramstein. When the door closed behind the officers, the command center erupted into whispered conversations. Senior NCOs were explaining to confused junior enlisted who exactly the Phantom was, while officers huddled in small groups, discussing the implications of having such a legendary figure quietly working maintenance on their base. "I told you to ease up," the crew chief from the hangar said, suddenly appearing beside Jenkins. "Some people aren't what they seem." "I didn't know," Jenkins managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was the point," the crew chief replied. "The question is, what are you going to do now that you do know?" Jenkins had no answer. He stood frozen, replaying weeks of mockery in his mind, seeing each incident through the new lens of understanding. The quiet competence, the deference from senior NCOs, the scars that spoke of battles he couldn't imagine. 20 minutes later, the office door opened. The general emerged first, followed by Colonel Harrington and Rodriguez. Their expressions gave nothing away, but there was a new energy in the room, an anticipation that hadn't been there before. "Continue with your duties," the general announced. "Colonel Rodriguez will remain in her current position, as she prefers. I expect each of you to maintain operational security regarding her identity and background. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, she's Lieutenant Rodriguez, maintenance officer." "Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," filled the room. The general nodded, satisfied. "Lieutenant," he said with a small smile, emphasizing her cover rank, "perhaps you join me for the rest of my tour of the base." "Of course, sir," Rodriguez replied. As they walked toward the exit, the general paused near Jenkins. He fixed the young private with a penetrating stare. "What's your name, son?" Jenkins snapped to attention. "Private First Class Jenkins, sir." The general studied him for a moment, then looked at Rodriguez. Something passed between them, an unspoken communication that Jenkins couldn't decipher. "Carry on, Private," the general finally said before continuing toward the door. Jenkins remained at attention until they had left the command center, then slumped against the nearest wall, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Staff Sergeant Davis approached, his expression stern but not unkind. "You look like you. Could use some air, Jenkins." "Yes, Sergeant," Jenkins replied automatically. Outside the command center, the bright German sunshine felt surreal after the tension of the last hour. Jenkins leaned against the building, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "I really messed up, didn't I?" he asked Davis, who had followed him outside. "Spectacularly," Davis agreed. But you're not the first cocky recruit to learn a hard lesson. You probably won't be the last. Those scars, Jenkins said quietly. They're not from paperwork accidents. Davis gave him a look that suggested Jenkins was stating the blindingly obvious. No, they're from pulling people out of burning vehicles under enemy fire. From jumping on a grenade that turned out to be a dud, but she didn't know that when she did it. From a dozen operations that people like you and me will never know about. Jenkins felt the weight of his ignorance crushing down on him. Why would someone like that be working maintenance at Ramstein? She could be anywhere, doing anything. Davis shrugged. Some questions don't have easy answers. Some people run toward the spotlight, others run away from it. The ones who run away are usually the ones who've seen things that the rest of us can't imagine. Jenkins nodded slowly, beginning to understand. What do I do now, Sergeant? You do your job, Davis replied simply. You learn from this. And maybe you think twice before judging someone based on what you think you know about them. After the general's inspection concluded, the command center slowly returned to normal operations, though the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Personnel kept stealing glances at Rodriguez, now revealed as Colonel Rodriguez, as she continued her duties as if nothing had happened. She maintained her quiet efficiency, neither acknowledging the newfound attention nor seeming bothered by it. Jenkins stood frozen at his terminal, unable to focus on his work. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to Rodriguez, seeing her now as if for the first time. The scars on her arms were no longer objects of mockery, but badges of valor, physical reminders of sacrifices he could barely comprehend. He jumped when Staff Sergeant Davis appeared beside him. You look like you've seen a ghost, Private, Davis said, a knowing look in his eye. I didn't know, Jenkins stammered. How could I have known? That was the point, Davis replied. Those scars you've been joking about? She got them extracting a team of surrounded operators in Kandahar. Carried the last one 3 miles with. Both arms sliced open by shrapnel. Never dropped him. Never cried out once. Jenkins swallowed hard, the image vivid in his mind. Why is she here? Working maintenance. Her cover was compromised on her last op. Too many people knew the legend of the Phantom by then. Rather than take a cushy Pentagon job or retirement, she chose to serve however she could. Maintenance was her background before special operations. Jenkins watched as senior officers who had barely acknowledged Rodriguez days before now approached her with reverence. Some offered muted congratulations on past successes they could only allude to. Others simply stood straighter in her presence. A silent show of respect. She received their newfound attention with the same quiet dignity with which she'd endured the previous invisibility. What happens now? Jenkins asked Davis. Now? Now we do our jobs, Davis replied. And maybe we remember that appearances can be deceiving. Throughout the afternoon, Jenkins struggled to concentrate on his assigned tasks. He kept replaying his interactions with Rodriguez, cringing at his own arrogance. The way he had dismissed her, the jokes at her expense, the casual disregard for her authority, it all seemed so childish now, so petty and small. As the day ended, Jenkins found himself alone with Colonel Rodriguez in the equipment room. He had been sent to retrieve some files, not realizing she was already there, reviewing maintenance logs at a small desk in the corner. When she looked up and saw him frozen in the doorway, she nodded calmly. Private Jenkins. Jenkins stood at attention, his heart pounding. Ma'am, Colonel, I need to apologize. The things I said about your scars, about you being just a maintenance officer, I had no idea. At ease, Private, she interrupted calmly. You weren't meant to know. But I was disrespectful, insubordinate. Yes, she agreed simply. No. Anger in her voice. You were. Her straightforward acknowledgement left him without defense. There was no anger to push against, no righteous indignation he could use to justify himself. Just a simple statement of fact. "I don't know what to say," Jenkins admitted. "Scars tell stories, Private," she said, rolling down her sleeves to cover the jagged marks. "Not all of them are meant to be shared. Judge less, observe more. That's all." She gathered her materials and walked past him toward the door. Before exiting, she paused. "Everyone makes mistakes, Jenkins. The measure of a soldier isn't in avoiding them, but in how they respond once they realize they've made one." With that, she was gone, leaving Jenkins alone with thoughts that would keep him awake long into the night. The next morning, Jenkins approached his duties with a new perspective. The cocky smirk was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to learn from his mistake. He arrived early, completed his assignments without complaint, and kept his head down. His friends noticed the change, questioning where his usual bravado had gone, but he deflected their questions with vague responses. At midday, he found himself in the maintenance bay, helping to inventory a new shipment of parts. Lieutenant Rodriguez, he still thought of her by that rank despite knowing the truth was across the hangar, instructing a group of new technicians on the intricacies of the F-35's diagnostic systems. "She's good," said Master Sergeant Williams, appearing at Jenkins's side. "Always has been. Even before ... Before?" Jenkins asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Before she became the Phantom," Williams clarified, keeping his voice low. "I knew her when she first enlisted. Always had a knack for systems, for seeing how things fit together. That same talent made her a natural for tactical operations. She could see patterns others missed, anticipate how enemy forces would move before they did." Jenkins nodded, watching as Rodriguez patiently guided a young airman through a complex diagnostic procedure. Why did she come back to maintenance, after everything she accomplished? Williams considered the question for a moment. Some people find peace in the work itself, in fixing things, making them whole again. Maybe after years of breaking things and people, she wanted to remember what it felt like to repair instead. The insight struck Jenkins as profound. He had always viewed maintenance as beneath him, a stepping stone to something more prestigious. But watching Rodriguez work, seeing the quiet satisfaction she took in solving problems and teaching others, he began to understand that there was dignity in the work itself, regardless of rank or recognition. Over the next 2 weeks, the base adjusted to the strange dichotomy of having a legendary special operator working quietly in their midst. For security reasons, personnel were instructed to maintain the fiction that she was Lieutenant Rodriguez, maintenance officer. But the way people treated her had subtly changed. There was more respect in their interactions, more attentiveness when she spoke. Jenkins changed too. He stopped trying to impress his peers with wisecracks and attitude. Instead, he focused on his work, on learning everything he could about the systems he was responsible for maintaining. Occasionally, he would find himself working alongside Rodriguez, and though their interactions remained professional, the hostility that had characterized their early encounters was gone. 2 weeks after the general's visit, Jenkins was working late, troubleshooting an issue with a diagnostic panel, when Rodriguez entered the maintenance bay. She was alone, apparently having returned after hours to complete some work. She nodded to him but didn't interrupt his concentration. For nearly an hour, they worked in companionable silence at opposite ends of the hangar. Finally, Jenkins solved his problem, letting out a small sound of satisfaction as the system came online. "Good work," Rodriguez said from across the space. "Those panels can be tricky." "Thank you, ma'am," Jenkins replied. He hesitated, then added, "May I ask you something?" Rodriguez approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "Go ahead." The crew chiefs talk about Operation Blackstone sometimes. They never give details, but the way they describe it, it sounds impossible, like something from a movie. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow, waiting for the actual question. Was it as bad as they say? Jenkins finally asked. As impossible? For a long moment, Rodriguez was silent, and Jenkins feared he had overstepped. Then she sighed softly. The thing about impossible situations, Jenkins, is that they're only impossible until someone does them. Then they become simply difficult. And difficult is something any well-trained soldier can handle. It wasn't really an answer, but Jenkins understood it was all she could give, all she would give. I used to think the most impressive soldiers were the ones with the most combat ribbons, Jenkins admitted. The ones with the stories that sound like action movies. And now? Rodriguez asked. Jenkins looked at her directly. Now I think maybe. The most impressive ones are the ones who do what needs to be done without needing everyone to know they did it. A ghost of a smile touched Rodriguez's lips. You're learning, Private. She checked her watch. It's late. Finish up and get some rest. Yes, ma'am. Jenkins nodded. As Rodriguez turned to leave, he added, Thank you. Not just for whatever you did out there that earned those scars, but for what you're doing here too. Rodriguez paused, surprised. After a moment, she nodded once acknowledgement and dismissal in the same gesture before walking away. The maintenance bay had settled into a new normal. Colonel Rodriguez, still using her lieutenant's insignia for day-to-day operations, continued overseeing the maintenance division with the same quiet efficiency. The difference was in how others treated her, with a deeper respect that went beyond rank. Jenkins had changed too. He watched Rodriguez training a group of new techs on hydraulic systems, patiently guiding them through procedures with calm expertise. No war stories, no leveraging her legendary status, just quiet competence and an occasional wry smile when someone got something right. Some heroes wear their medals, Master Sergeant Williams said, appearing beside Jenkins. Others just wear their scars. Jenkins nodded, understanding at last. I used to think the most impressive soldiers were the ones who talked the biggest game, he admitted. And now, Jenkins watched as Colonel Rodriguez rolled down her sleeves at the end of her shift, covering the jagged reminders of battles fought. In shadows, now I know better. The most impressive ones never needed to say a word. Williams clapped him on the shoulder. You might make a decent soldier yet, Jenkins. As Jenkins finished his own shift, he passed by the command center. Through the window, he could see Rodriguez in conversation with Colonel Harrington. They stood as equals, despite the disparity in their visible ranks, discussing something over a spread of maps and diagrams. Jenkins realized that he would never know the full story of who Colonel Maya Phantom Rodriguez really was. He would never hear the details of Operation Blackstone or understand exactly what she had done to earn the respect of generals. That knowledge was reserved for those with the clearance and need to know, and he was neither. But he had learned something more valuable. The true strength lay not in boasting or demanding recognition, but in quietly doing what needed to be done. That some of the most remarkable people were the ones who never sought the spotlight, who served with quiet dignity, regardless of whether their contributions were seen or acknowledged. The next morning, when a new batch of recruits arrived at Ramstein, Jenkins noticed one of them smirking at Lieutenant Rodriguez as she walked past, eyeing her scars with the same ignorant mockery he himself had once displayed. I'd be careful there, Jenkins said quietly to the recruit. You never know who someone really is until you've walked in their boots. What? Her? She's just a maintenance officer, the recruit scoffed. Jenkins smiled, thinking of generals who saluted lieutenants and legends who chose to serve in shadow. Trust me, he said, there's no such thing as just anything in this man's army. As Rodriguez disappeared around the corner, Jenkins turned back to his work, carrying with him the lesson she had taught him without ever meaning to, that true valor didn't need an audience. He had learned to judge less and observe more. He had learned that the quietest voices sometimes carried the most weight, and that the most profound strength often wore the most humble disguise. Most importantly, he had learned that respect wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. One quiet act of service at a time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar shadows across the maintenance bay. But for Jenkins, everything looked different now. He saw the dignity in the work, the honor in the service, and the profound courage it took to serve without recognition. In the end, Lieutenant Rodriguez had taught him the most important lesson of his military career without saying a word, that the true measure of a soldier wasn't in the medals on their chest or the stories they told, but in the quiet dedication they brought to whatever mission they were given. And sometimes, the most extraordinary people were the ones who looked most ordinary, until you learned to see them with the respect they had always deserved. Jenkins smiled to himself as he returned to his duties, finally understanding what it meant to be a soldier. Not the Hollywood version with the dramatic speeches and glory-seeking heroics, but the real thing, quiet, professional, dedicated service, regardless of who was watching or what recognition might come. It was a lesson worth learning, and one he would carry with him for the rest of his career. The Phantom had taught him well. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.